The teacher missing from Cold Springs Elementary. Parents in Placerville still mention a teacher who left her classroom keys on the desk, stepped into the breezeway, and vanished. The building sits north of Main Street, where the oak trees break the summer wind and buses idle near the loop. Afternoon bell lines faded under traffic noise, while a janitor rolled a static-scarred cart toward the multipurpose room. No one noticed anything unusual until the office printer kept spitting forms long after the halls went quiet. Her name in district rosters is Janine Clark, 34, fifth grade teacher, in town to finish a contracted year. She rented a small studio south of Broadway, reportedly quiet, and kept a habit of walking to work before sunup. Colleagues described careful lesson plans stacked by week and a folded cardigan tucked inside a drawer near the class library. County file from 2009 shows a previous placement in Humboldt County with satisfactory notes and no disciplinary flags. On a warm Thursday in late May of 2019, the office clock read 3:20 when dismissal wrapped. Several students returned for forgotten lunchboxes, one parent asked about reading logs, and buses pulled away. Janine signed the dismissal sheet, placed 2 graded packets in a labeled bin, and told the secretary she would lock up. Dispatch logs later noted a routine call about a stalled sedan on Placerville Drive, unrelated, around the same window. The custodian that week was Arthur Mendez, 57. Night shift, on site to prep the gym for a community meeting. He said he saw Janine cross the breezeway with a manila folder under one arm, moving toward the staff room. He remembered a quick wave and a half smile, nothing hurried, and a quiet hallway where the trophy case hummed. His statement says he kept mopping by the south doors until the wax turned even and the clock hit 4. At 4:15, according to archive notes kept by the principal, a substitute teacher named Erin stopped by the copier. She noticed the machine running with no one nearby, pages in neat stacks, and a sticky note asking to refill paper. The sticky note showed Janine's looping script, though investigators never confirmed the note's exact time because the ink bled slightly. Erin said she refilled the tray, gathered the stacks, and left them on the counter under a laminated safety poster. State records show the district uses a keycard system that logs exterior entries, though interior movement remains untracked. The card assigned to Janine recorded entry at 6:51 that morning, and no exit swipe appears that afternoon. Investigators cautioned that propped doors near the breezeway could bypass the system, and some locals claimed staff sometimes did that. Maintenance logs mention hinge repairs on the east exit, possibly encouraging the practice when the wind pressed hard against the frame. A parent volunteer named Samuel Wright, 41, delivery driver, on-site to stack donated books, offered a different recollection. He carried 2 boxes toward the library when he heard a short conversation from the staff room that he could not parse. He saw a figure in a blue jacket by the vending machine, not a teacher he recognized, facing the window. He did not see Janine, and he reported the detail only after reading a notice requesting timelines the following Monday. Investigators mapped movements on a campus diagram printed from county archives using colored pins to mark estimated positions and times. The staff room window faces a small garden where students grow tomatoes, and a service gate opens toward the back lot. Security cameras cover the front entrance and the bus loop, leaving the service gate and breezeway without recording. Some locals claimed a camera once watched the breezeway, though budget minutes do not confirm any equipment there during that year. Janine's sedan remained in the parking row closest to the flagpole when deputies arrived around 7 after a delayed call. She kept a reusable water bottle in the cup holder and a spiral notebook on the passenger seat with math notes. The engine was cold and the windows were cracked a finger width, which is common when classrooms run warm in May. A small tote in the back seat contained graded essays bundled with twine and a paper marked for revision. Her phone pinged the tower near Bedford Avenue until 4:27, then showed no further activity that day. A records technician later explained that coverage drops inside certain parts of the building, especially near the inner hall. Investigators never confirmed whether the device powered down or lost battery because the handset was not recovered. The district retains a bring-your-own-device policy, which complicates retrieval of carrier details without a separate order. County file from 2009 includes an older missing person from the same district, though the circumstances differ widely. That case involved a grounds worker who left during a winter storm and returned 2 days later without explanation. Some locals claimed a pattern, but the sheriff publicly said the comparison did not hold and records conflict on timing. The archived notes from that earlier incident emphasize exhausted staffing and slow road clearance rather than campus conditions. A neighbor at Janine's complex told deputies she heard footsteps outside the unit around 5:45 that morning. She described keys clinking and a short cough, which matches a routine Janine mentioned at a staff wellness meeting. The neighbor did not see anyone that afternoon, and she thought Janine would attend a training on the following day. That training appears in district calendars, location marked as the county office, which aligns with emails recovered from the principal's account. A week later, search teams walked the trails behind the school where oak leaves gather in dry gullies. They checked culverts near the water district fence and traced the drainage channel that runs toward the old railroad grade. Cadaver dogs alerted once near a cluster of trash cans, then lost interest, which handlers later described as inconsistent. Investigators never confirmed that alert because wind and heat had shifted and the cans had been emptied earlier that morning. Friends from her previous post in Humboldt County described a cautious person who favored steady routines over last-minute plans. She called her mother on Sundays, kept receipts in envelopes by month, and logged miles for tax records with tidy lines. In Placerville, she reportedly joined a small literacy group that met near Cedar Ravine on alternating Thursdays for practice tutoring. Attendance sheets show 3 meetings in April and early May, and her name appears on each page in neat print. The principal told investigators that budget season pulled staff into long hours and multiple hiring files stacked on her desk. She said she spoke briefly with Janine about a special education referral, and she promised to follow up by email. That email exists in the server archive, timestamped 112, with a short reply from Janine at 1:14. The reply references a student name that is redacted in released records, which limits independent confirmation of the context. Several community members recalled seeing a white pickup near the service gate at approximately 4, parked crooked with no emblem. A grounds crew worker said the truck belonged to a vendor who repaired drinking fountains, though the schedule lists no visit. Investigators never confirmed the plate because the gate camera did not exist, and statements vary on the exact bumper stickers. Some locals claimed they saw a ladder in the bed, while others remembered a cooler and a tangle of rope. The custodian Arthur later clarified that he locked the East Hall at 4:30, then walked toward the dumpsters. He said the sky had turned pale with high cirrus and the gym smelled like fresh varnish from the morning coat. He rolled the empty cart past the staff room and noticed a chair pulled out, a half banana, and a humming refrigerator. He did not see the manila folder, and he could not say whether the copier stacks had been moved inside. Family interviews indicate Janine planned a weekend trip to Auburn to see an old roommate who waited at a cafe. The roommate sent a message at 6, then another at 7, and assumed traffic had slowed the drive. When no reply came by 9, she called the district number on the website and reached voicemail. She filed a welfare check request, which appears in dispatch logs at 9:23, triggering the evening response to the campus. A teacher from a neighboring classroom said she found a sticky note under a stapler on the following morning. The note read that a parent conference needed rescheduling after a sibling pickup issue, and the signature looked like Janine's line. Investigators never confirmed whether the note was written that day or earlier in the week, and light smudges complicated analysis. The pen used matched office stock pens that many staff share, which limited any useful tracing of ink purchase records. A local who walks dogs near the fence line reported hearing a short whistle from the garden area around 4:10. He thought it was a child imitating a bird and did not approach the gate, which often sticks near the latch. He later wondered if it signaled someone, though investigators cautioned against building narratives from faint memory. His statement was filed, and the report notes residual mower noise from a neighbor's yard that could mimic a whistle. State records confirm that Janine held a valid credential, and her evaluations listed steady classroom management with consistent routines. Her attendance from January through May showed 2 personal days for dental work and 1 sick day after a winter cold. Payroll noted a pending stipend for after-school tutoring, which had not yet been issued when the year closed. None of those items suggested sudden resignation, and investigators emphasized that employment indicators can mislead when other pressures build quietly. During summer, crews replaced the east exit hinges and repainted the breezeway where varnish had peeled under repeated heat. A maintenance supervisor said the project had been scheduled earlier and supplies were ordered before the school year ended. Some locals claimed the timing erased scuffs that might matter, though county guidelines require routine upkeep before fall. Investigators never confirmed whether any scuff carried evidentiary value, and photos in the file show only generalized wear. In September of that year, hikers reported a neatly folded cardigan near a turnout on Mosquito Road beyond the river. Deputies collected it and noted size and label, which aligned with a brand Janine favored in photos from field trips. The cardigan carried no traceable tag to the store, and rain had passed, which softened any residue on the fabric. The lab report listed indeterminate results, and records conflict on whether the color matched one seen in her classroom drawer. A tip line produced calls about a blue jacket figure seen near the staff room, but descriptions varied by height. One caller remembered a limp, another mentioned a ball cap, and a third thought the zipper shone under fluorescent light. Investigators compared the accounts, and they never confirmed whether those details refer to a single person or several passers-by. The vending machine vendor list showed restock on Tuesday, not Thursday, which complicates assumptions about who lingered in that corner. As the year turned, the district reassigned the classroom and boxed the remaining supplies for storage in a locked cage. A new teacher unpacked the math notebooks after winter break and found a roster with penciled updates beside surnames. The updates match Janine's handwriting according to a reading specialist who trained with her, though the date line is blank. The specialist gave a statement that she last saw Janine at lunchtime on Thursday, standing by the copy room doorway. A brief item ran in the local paper referencing a missing teacher, and it led with courteous language about community support. The article cited the sheriff and the principal with spare quotes, and it named the school without giving the address. Comments online drifted toward speculation about roadways and footpaths, which investigators discourage when maps can mislead. That caution appears in archived notes from early briefings, and the phrasing repeats across updates released over the next months. By spring of the next year, the case summary condensed into a timeline that begins with the morning entry swipe. It lists classroom activities through dismissal, notes the copier running, places Arthur in the South Hall, and places Samuel near the library. It marks the unverified blue jacket sighting, the unlogged service gate area, and the sedan parked by the flagpole when dusk settled. Then the line ends with the phone ping drop and a blank field where investigators wrote pending until further leads arise. Some locals claimed they saw her hiking on weekends near Cronin Ranch, yet trail cameras never placed her there. Others believed a rideshare picked her up near the loop, but state records show no relevant trips in that time. Theories about staff conflicts appear in informal threads, and investigators never confirmed any disputes that fit the timeline. The available documents lean toward quiet routine turning into absence, and the file holds that shape without stating a cause. The district still keeps her name in older newsletters stored on a public folder that parents browse during enrollment. There are photos of book fairs and science night tables, and in one image, she adjusts a poster while students grin. None of the images show unusual visitors, and timestamps land months before late May, which narrows their significance. The folder remains a reference point for volunteers who remember that spring and for families who ask about the old garden. The classroom has new posters now, and the breezeway smells like wax again when summer arrives and heat rises. Children run toward buses, teachers wave with clipboards, and the office printer chugs through permission slips that stack on the counter. A sign near the garden asks people to keep the gate closed, though the latch still feels loose on windy afternoons. The story remains mostly paper and recollection, anchored by dispatch logs and sober lines that leave the ending open. The snowplow incident on Dalton Highway. In early winter of 2019, a road crew based near Coldfoot reported a missing operator after an overnight maintenance run north. Drivers said the weather thinned for an hour near Otagon Pass, then returned with sharp spindrift across the grade. The report reached a small dispatch room where radio traffic had stayed busy with chain controls and stalled rigs. The first message named a man who left mile marker notes, then failed to clear his scheduled checkpoint on the north slope. The operator was Mark Reyes, 44, a contract plow driver from Fairbanks assigned to the Slope District for the season. He ran a late shift that began after dusk with fuel topped and a spare V-belt strapped under the seat. His purpose was straightforward since the company had a fixed route that required timed passes across exposed sections. Witnesses remembered his voice on the radio sounding even, with short replies that kept to mile numbers and cold readings. Dispatch logs from that night list a start north of Coldfoot at 1900 hours, with guidance to hold before Otagon if winds rose. Archived notes in the district binder describe patch ice near the summit and reports of light snow sliding off the cut banks. A tanker convoy reportedly waited near Dietrich River since heavy gusts had pushed 2 tractor-trailers into the berm earlier. The shift sheet shows Dana Willis, 39, a dispatcher based in Fairbanks, who stayed on the channel while supervisors rotated. State records show Reyes had 12 winters on heavy equipment, with no citations and a completed safety course during 2011. He'd worked pipeline access roads, he'd pulled a grader for a private quarry, and he'd logged clear plow counts on previous runs. His intent that night was to punch through 3 choke points, then meet a mechanic near Galbraith Lake for a salt spreader swap. The mechanic was Evan Tuttle, 52, a seasonal hire whose task was to transfer gear and check hydraulic temperatures before midnight. Some locals claimed a whiteout dropped into the pass fast enough to erase taillights and mute engine sound, yet truckers never agreed. One driver said strobing snow gave the illusion of hills moving sideways across the road while the wheels stayed straight. Another said the wind was loud, but gaps kept opening, and distant beacons appeared steady along the grade for several minutes. Investigators never confirmed a single window of clear weather, since recordings captured only static bursts and clipped phrases around the summit. At 2100, Reyes checked in at a pullout south of the pass, with coolant temperature stable and front blade pressure within range. He mentioned one brief shudder through the chassis that felt like a rut, then silence followed until a short click cut the frequency. Willis radioed back twice with location requests and received nothing, then pinged a nearby rig to scan the shoulder with high beams. The rig driver said he saw drifting grooves that could have been old tracks since fresh snow filled them within seconds. A tracker unit on the plow reportedly sent 3 location bursts clustered near a curve marked by a steep drop to the creek. Technicians said the pings bounced off a repeater and came through delayed, so the timing stamps failed to match the voice log. Search teams moved in after midnight from both sides, and a grader led with chains laced tight across 2 tires. Snow fell in sheets that flattened depth and made shallow cuts look like pits, which slowed the lead truck to walking speed. They reached the curve at first light and found a blade mark that ended clean beside a low drift with no metal exposed. A second pass scraped the shoulder and revealed a hard ridge with chunks of ice wedged above a narrow gouge that fell away. Rope teams moved over the edge and found short slide debris on a bench, then a broken marker flag snagged against brush. No frame parts surfaced during those hours, and the creek ran under plates of ice that shifted with a faint grinding sound. County file from 2009 includes a similar incident where a grader vanished for 2 days before surfacing downstream near a bend. That case resolved when thaw lowered the berm and exposed a mirror that caught sun from a brief break in cloud. The comparison circulated among crew members who kept working the shoulder, yet the terrain here was different with steeper runoff cuts. Records conflict on how quickly the water can rise under drifted ice after strong wind, and the team deferred to the field lead. By late morning, a fuel tender from Deadhorse reached the site and set up heaters near a staging point above the drop. Tuttle arrived from the north with tools and asked for the last radio phrase, then checked the hydraulic lines of a parked plow. He noted a tendency for the quick couplers to chatter during crosswind, which could sound like harsh rattle over the cab floor. Mechanics later wrote that cab noise might mask a failing sensor, since cold snap could trigger alarms that barely breached the static. Aerial support from a contractor circled the pass after wind eased, and the observer described a faint brown scar cutting the slope. The scar blended with ripples left by earlier slides, and a few dark smudges along the line looked like willows pressed flat. Photographs show no bright paint or reflective decal, though one frame catches a straight groove pointing toward a tight creek bend. Investigators never confirmed those features as relevant, since snow squalls smeared edges between frames and made distances hard to judge. Afternoon brought a partial clearing that revealed a fan of ice shards downstream, and a thin sheen of coolant floated in a pool. Samples were jarred for testing, and the chain crew shifted downhill with bars to pry plates loose where the creek narrowed. A snapped radio whip surfaced near a root ball and looked fresh, but the base had no distinct paint and the mount was missing. Some locals claimed scavengers grabbed parts fast after wind events, although crews said nothing moves under that much drifted ice. Willis compiled a timeline that night using dispatch logs and audio clips, then flagged minutes where Reyes last sounded clear and calm. She included notes on tanker releases and 2 reports about a stopped reefer whose engine coughs overlapped the plow check-in. The final packet lists contacts with the State Patrol and a maintenance foreman who drove south to relieve the tired search crew. That foreman added tire print photos that seem to double along the shoulder, which can occur when chains stamp over their own path. During the second day, a Parkerized tow hook appeared in a melt pocket with scratches no wider than a thumbnail along the curve. The hook matched a model used on the plow fleet, yet maintenance inventory showed 6 variations that had circulated for years. Without a serial, technicians wrote a reserved note that placed the hook in a probable category rather than as verified evidence. Some locals claimed the hook drifted from higher on the slope, while others said the creek likely dragged it after a brief surge. On the third day, crews uncovered a ladder rack buried in compact snow beside a narrow stand of willows near the creek. The rack fit, the plow make, and bolt patterns lined up within tolerances, which moved the case toward a likely location. A downstream net caught a small panel stamped with 2 digits that matched the fleet series, though corrosion blurred the final number. Investigators never confirmed whether the panel came from Reyes's machine, and state records marked the find as inconclusive with an asterisk. A trucker who runs that road each week provided a sworn statement that places a bright headlight west of the proper lane. He said the beam cut across a hump of snow and flashed once, then vanished as wind shifted, which he logged against his odometer. Another driver produced a dash recording where only hiss and faint pops can be heard during that minute near the summit pullout. Records conflict on whether either account fits the minute Reyes went quiet, since clock drift and reception gaps complicate the match. A fourth-day probe found the plow nose buried in a kink where the creek dives under a bank and resurfaces in a small pool. Divers worked under ice with lines and spotted a cab corner wedged against a boulder, then a shattered mirror floating free. The recovery took hours as the weather dropped again, and the team cut a trench to guide the frame toward a winch. When the cab cleared, the seatbelt latch showed marks from impact, and the ignition key sat half-turned with the radio switch on. The medical report is brief and cites blunt force trauma with a probable sequence that begins with a sudden drop along the hidden bank. It notes no sign of alcohol and a normal panel, plus bruising that aligns with a violent jolt as the frame struck rock. Investigators never confirmed whether the initial slide began from crosswind push or a shelf collapse that undercut the drift from below. The final line lists cause as accident during storm response, with contributing factors that include limited visibility and shifting ice. In the months after, crews added poles near the curve and new markers above the creek, and radio checks increased before the summit. The company revised night runs and paired plows for that section, while dispatch set tighter windows for convoys during early gust fronts. Some locals claim the changes came too late and that old warnings about the creek shelf sat ignored in a forgotten drawer. Archived notes show earlier mentions of undercut edges that never reached policy, though supervisors say budget cycles delayed permanent fixes. The Dalton Highway kept running through that winter and the next, and the pass remained a place where visibility turns to noise. State records preserve the photographs and the hook, and the rack sits tagged in a bin that lists the mile number. Drivers still slow near the curve and watch the creek where drifted plates hold for a week, then crack without warning. The file closes with a sentence that keeps to the facts and a road sign that leans slightly north when the wind rises. The stories. These archived tapes were a warning at the lake. The county kept a box of old tapes that nobody requested, though people mentioned a lake in half the labels. Each reel carried a handwritten date in faded ink, spanning from 1984 through 2001, then stopping abruptly. Rena Valdez was 34, a county records technician who covered the public window and handled the backroom shelves. She had planned a quick shift, then a quiet drive to her sister's apartment for leftover stew and television. The box of tapes ruined that plan because the new intern stacked it crookedly and the lid slid open suddenly. One cardboard sleeve read Lake Patrol. Another said Ranger Tower 2. The thickest sleeve said Dispatch Saturdays. A note at the bottom said duplicates for training, reportedly returned after audit, do not discard. The dates matched a period locals still referenced with nervous jokes, which meant details might still identify private people. She logged the box in a generic way, using the Lakeshore District and a wide date range to protect identities. She told herself it would wait until Monday, then she found herself winding a reel on the library machine. The machine clicked softly, and a voice filled the tiny playback room, thin and metallic. The first tape was a ranger briefing about posted signs and seasonal closures, and nothing seemed strange at first hearing. A man listed wind patterns, then a woman read names for volunteer cleanups, and then someone said maintenance reported missing bolts on the north dock. The voice added that the bolts were not stripped, they were removed carefully without damaging the boards. A second tape included a dispatcher answering calls about diesel sheen near the old boat ramp. According to the label, fishermen reported a smell like hot plastic, and a teenager reported chain rattling under the planks after dark. The dispatcher kept people calm while advising them to stick to lit areas and avoid the roped section. Rena paused the machine and wrote notes in her spiral, keeping each line factual with times and initials. She checked the storage log for incident reports from those dates, and the log showed vague entries about routine patrol and no injuries. It seemed like a cluster of small maintenance problems, which did not explain the careful script on the warning sleeves. She switched reels, and a new voice took over, quieter and closer to the microphone. The label said Saturdays 2, with a date from 1991 in shaky handwriting and a stamped number. The voice mentioned archived calls about chain noises again, and added that footprints led down the roped section in soft silt. Someone in the room asked about weather, and the answer was light wind, clear night, no boats scheduled after sunset. The voice then read a memo that asked rangers to log all interactions with a particular vendor near the snack stand. It said, do not escalate, document demeanor, and confirm hours against posted permits, using a separate clipboard. Rena recognized the clipboard instruction style, which matched old county risk templates for potential liability tracking. Vendors generated paperwork when things went sideways, especially near open water with kids, which made steady documentation crucial later. Still, the tapes kept circling the same triangle of dock bolts, chain noises, and the roped section. She printed a map from the binder with blank labels, then drew a tidy triangle between the dock, the snack stand, and the ranger tower. The map helped her visualize lines of sight, and she started marking places with little asterisks for maintenance incidents. The roped section sat slightly east, hidden from the snack stand by cottonwoods, which mattered for visibility. Another reel played a clipped exchange where a ranger told dispatch that a gate lock appeared new and unregistered. The ranger added that cones were moved and a laminated warning sign had clean nail holes without rust. The dispatcher asked for photos, and the answer was already taken and copied for the folder labeled permits. The next tape changed tone with a shaky breath before an officer started reading notes into the recorder deliberately. He said witnesses reported a loud splash near midnight, then a truck engine idling on the far turnout. He said tracks showed heavy tread, then lighter footsteps heading back alone, and a partial plate was recorded without certainty. Rena stopped and checked the case index, trying to locate an incident number referencing a midnight splash during that month. The index only showed a maintenance order for replacing stolen chain and a request for more reflective tape. She underlined the lack of a matching incident and added a small arrow to her running list for later verification. On Tuesday morning, she asked her supervisor if she could inventory the box more thoroughly since the reels were fragile. He nodded without interest, telling her to log whatever needed logging and to shove the box behind tax rolls. That gave her private time in the playback room, which she used to build a timeline on fresh paper. She listened to another Saturday tape where a woman from the tower called dispatch about a boat drifting across the boundary. The boat moved lazily, but the line drifted toward the roped section, which was posted as no entry. The woman sounded firm, and she logged the time. Then she asked for a ranger with a bullhorn. A tiny clink echoed on the tape before a second voice said, "Hold on," then added that a chain was loosened again. The tower watched two shapes bending by the boundary floats, and the dispatcher repeated the request for immediate response. Sirens filtered faintly through the recorder. Then the tape ended with an abrupt click that did not feel accidental. Rena checked the log again and found only a note about routine lake closure with citation for boundary violation. She highlighted the citation number and scribbled a request to pull the paper copy from the offsite cabinet. If the citation sheet had officer notes, she might find names replaced with initials and a vendor detail. In the afternoon, the intern returned with coffee, and Rena asked if he knew the lake from hiking around. He said his cousins called it the turnaround because teens use the far turnout to swap drivers late at night. He said people heard the chain in the wind and joked that it meant a shift change for the lake. She asked about the vendor by the snack stand, and he shrugged, saying an older guy sold bait from a cooler. He added that the man kept to himself and that the stand closed after 2003 when bathrooms needed repair. Rena thanked him, then went back to the machine, because one more reel had Ranger Tower 2 in heavy ink. The reel opened with playful teasing about coffee. Then a woman said the boundary floats were drifting again toward the shallow shelf. She made a note that the vendor stayed late, counting cash, and that 3 pickup trucks idled by the turnout. She said wind from the ridge pushed small waves against the dock posts, and the sound carried. Then came a gentle thud, and the woman said quietly that bolt heads were missing again on the north ladder. She asked anyone nearby to bring a camera and mentioned small shavings near the posts, like metal caught and ground shiny. She said it looked new, not weathered, and suggested logging it as tampering after checking permits. Rena wrote ladder bolt heads missing and circled the phrase carefully, then drew a line to the earlier chain note. She felt the outline of something organized, not merely bad luck, and the tapes added a pattern of late Saturdays. She felt a pinch of frustration because the official paper trail looked deliberately harmless compared to the recordings. She filed a request to review tower logs that year, and the clerk gave her a battered binder with loose pages. The tower logs used pencil, and the Saturday pages looked smudged, but several entries repeated a vendor name pattern. The pattern matched the earlier instruction to log demeanor and hours, which meant quiet escalation without confrontation. An evening tape from 2001 began with static. Then the dispatcher said the tower line would record summaries every hour. The tower voice read weather, then listed vehicles, then paused at a truck with a partially obscured plate covered by dust. The tower added that the truck bed held a heavy chain coiled flat and the ends taped tight. Rena felt the air in the room go thin, though she knew she was just listening to old caution collected for audits. The tower voice kept going, steady and calm, calling out 2 sets of footsteps and 1 pair returning alone toward the turnout. Then the tower said the vendor appeared nervous, closing early and locking a cooler with a new padlock. Another reel documented a ranger walking the roped section at dawn, taking photos of raw scrapes on chain links. The ranger said the scrapes were bright, not dull, and the boundary floats had new gouges near the welded rings. He guessed someone had dragged the chain to the shelf, making deep channels beside the ladder posts. She studied the map again, measuring distances with the edge of a note card and aligning the triangle to the shoreline. The shelf sat where the cold current ran channel to channel, sucking down loose gear and stunned fish every spring. If someone knew that flow, they could use it to hide things quickly, maybe even move something heavy without splashing. The county maintained a box of anonymous tips from that period, and Rena requested the file through the clerk quietly. The tips mentioned fights in the turnout, and a truck with fresh dents, and late-night cash counting by the stand. One tip described a crying woman near the chain in 1991, then wrote, "He told her to get in now." Rena breathed slowly and kept her notes clinical, because she was not a detective and the tapes were not a case file. She wrote potential domestic dispute near boundary, then wrote check for missing persons in overlapping county dates. She cross-referenced the years against a public list of unresolved reports, without printing names or addresses. Within that public list, several families had posted memorial pages that mentioned the lake vaguely without pinning a location. The dates brushed the Saturday span, and at least one message thanked volunteers who had searched old drainage channels. Rena did not draw conclusions, but she felt the box had been kept near the window for a reason. The thickest reel contained a training segment that sounded like a quiet warning wrapped as procedure. A supervisor read instructions for dock inspections, then emphasized that bolts should be numbered and painted once installed. He said repeated substitutions by outside contractors had caused confusion, then urged rangers to photograph every ladder each week. He read slowly, reminding staff to check chain markings and to log any bright scrapes within 24 hours. He asked that vendor interactions stay cordial but detailed, and that cash counts should match posted hour sheets precisely. He repeated that night closures had reasons, and that the roped section protected a shelf known for unpredictable suction. The tape ended with a short statement that felt heavier than a standard sign-off, even to someone outside enforcement work. The supervisor said the lake keeps receipts, and he called tape steel a kind of ledger if you knew how to read. He then asked that all summaries be placed in the Saturday binder, followed by a written note in the permit folder. Rena returned the reels to their sleeves, then updated the entry in the inventory system with a quiet summary. She wrote that the contents included dispatch summaries, tower logs, and training instructions, and that these might interest risk management. She flagged the box for restricted copying and added a line suggesting improved storage due to evidentiary value. That night, she drove to the lake and parked by the official overlook, staying within the open hours like a normal visitor. The water looked glossy and harmless, and a steady breeze shoved new leaves across the shore in rattling waves. Families packed up coolers, while a ranger checked the rope line and reset a slack float with a practice tug. She walked the path between the tower and the snack stand, then down to the dock where the ladder bolts gleamed. They were painted red, and small numbers were stamped into the heads, which suggested a new practice after the tapes. A sign near the rope read "No entry, shelf unstable," and the letters were bold without clutter. A man in a lake crew shirt saw her taking photos and asked if she needed anything, and she said just admiring. He nodded and said they had redone the hardware, then added that the chain had been upgraded to a heavier gauge. He pointed out a new anchor a few yards deeper where the current used to pull and said it cost plenty. She asked if the improvements followed a particular incident, and he smiled without offering details, then looked toward the tower. He said the lake gets busier every year, and they prefer keeping rules friendly and simple to help everyone. He wished her a good evening and kept walking, tapping each cleat along the dock with a small hammer. At her desk the next morning, she wrote one final paragraph for the internal memo, careful with every single word. She explained that the tapes documented a pattern of weekend tampering around a hazardous shelf with persistent chain disturbances. She wrote that witnesses described idling trucks and partial plates, and that tower logs flagged a vendor for careful tracking. She recommended digitizing the reels, then filing them with risk management as potential warnings that improved current safety practices. She attached her timeline and map using initials and generic labels to avoid identifying anyone who might still live nearby. She kept her tone neutral because the point was preservation, not drama, and the tapes already carried weight. Before sealing the memo, she added a small line that explained how the tapes worked like a quiet lighthouse. They glowed in the dark of back rooms, keeping watch over a place that looked relaxed but demanded attention. They did not accuse anyone directly, but they pointed toward the triangle where the water kept its swift accounting. She delivered the memo to her supervisor, who skimmed it, then set it aside for the weekly folder without comment. He asked if the reels were labeled securely, and she said yes, and he nodded and said, "Good, thank you." The box returned to the shelf, but the entry now carried a bright strip indicating restricted handling under department guidance. A week later, risk management requested digital transfers, citing an internal review of seasonal safety procedures for public areas. They noted that the dock hardware had improved and that the chain layout matched new engineering reports after recent surveys. They asked for any additional recordings from surrounding years to complete their context for training material. Rena stayed out of that conversation because her role stopped at preservation, though she felt a calm sense of completion. The Saturday binder had finally spoken in full sentences, and everything pointed toward the same quiet conclusion. The tapes were a warning written in small sounds that added up to a clear map of careful harm. When she finally visited her sister that weekend, the stew tasted warm, and the apartment felt crowded with plants. She described none of the lake details, only saying she liked hearing old voices explain rules that still mattered today. Her sister laughed and said she had always loved rule followers because they were the ones who kept doors from sticking. In the months that followed, the dock signs stayed bright, the chains stayed tight, and the roped section kept its distance. Families watched sunsets without wandering across the floats, while rangers checked the ladder bolts and stamped numbers. A new plaque near the overlook said thank you to volunteers for years of safe seasons without naming anyone specifically. People told stories anyway, because lakes attract stories, and most were harmless and not entirely accurate. Rena preferred the tapes because they never chased drama, and they always returned to measured facts. They cared about footprints on silt and bright scrapes on metal and the way a current can tell time. If someone asked her privately why a box of tapes mattered, she offered a simple answer without personal detail. The lake taught the staff to listen for small patterns, and the tapes taught the staff to write them down. Warnings are not always loud, and sometimes they arrive as quiet instructions that keep strangers safe. She thought of the supervisor who said the lake keeps receipts, and she believed him without needing a name or headline. The water gave back bolts and shavings and slack rope, and the staff learned to read that ledger patiently. In that way, the old Saturday voices kept working, guiding hands without demanding attention or applause. By the next summer, the tower logged more visitors and fewer citations, and the vendor stand sold cold drinks, not bait. The chain still hummed on windy nights, but people heard it as a plain boundary, not a rumor. The tapes stayed in climate storage, digitized and labeled, a warning preserved as training rather than tragedy. When the county finally archived the memo with the transfer receipts, Rena slid a copy into her personal binder. She liked the neatness of an ending that did not demand a dramatic reveal, only patient steps that matched evidence. The lake did not need a ghost, it needed attention, and those tapes had asked for it many years ago. She drove by the overlook after work one evening, watching the sun burn down into a clean line on the water. A ranger tapped the cleats again, just like before, and the chain lay tight and bright across the current. The triangle she drew on paper felt like a familiar shape in her mind, precise and ordinary, and finally understood. The bridge collapse files of Red River County. Locals in Clarksville still point toward the slow bend of the Red River and mention a span that failed without warning. They talk about a sound like lumber snapping across a barnyard and a brown cloud that rolled off the water. Some say the river went quiet for a full minute. Others insist the current rushed harder against the pilings. The event sits between printed pages and tired memories, where dates blur and names drift across coffee counters. Investigators never confirmed a single narrative, and the surviving paperwork reads like a map with two north arrows. The first name that appears across the county file from 2009 is Thomas Avery, 52, consulting civil engineer, in town to review seasonal scour near the east abutment. He arrived from Texarkana on a rented pickup, carried a folding stadia rod, and booked a room at a roadside motor court. His notes, reportedly scanned and misplaced twice, show pencil sketches with neat arrows along gravel approaches. He wrote that spring runoff had undercut a clay shelf and that riprap placement lagged a full year. He planned a second pass at lower water with a contractor present and a county foreman on site. Dispatch logs from the same period reference Maria Kent, 41, paramedic with Red River EMS, sent toward the span after a motorist report about drifting planks. Her unit rolled north on farm-to-market roads with steady radio checks and a quiet engine whine. The log timestamps conflict with her own written addendum, which places her arrival 8 minutes before the first deputy. She noted empty guardrails and a harder breeze from the west that pushed dust into the shallows. She stayed at the south approach and waited for a crew to secure a lane with cones and a chain. A third figure threads through state records and later summaries: Caleb Ross, 29, county road crew foreman, scheduled to meet Avery for a survey walk. He reportedly left the yard early with a steel tape, a faded vest, and a thermos dented along one side. The daybook from his shop lists a fuel top off at 6, a load of rock at 7, and a plan to check the far pier before lunch. Some locals claimed Ross stopped at a grocery for ice and never returned to the truck. Others stated he reached the bridge and waved toward the river. The record of his exact route remains unsettled, and the receipt pile is thinner than expected. Archive notes say the span was a modest truss with timber decking and 3 concrete piers set in an easy channel. The far bank rose into cottonwoods, and the near bank held a graded turnout where anglers backed trailers down a slab. Maintenance logs speak of patched planks and a cracked bearing plate that had been shimmed on a wet afternoon. The repair order shows a red pencil remark that reads, "Still serviceable under single lane only." No one signed a final clearance, and the renewal request died in a stack under a broken stapler. When the structure failed, the sequence becomes a field of magnets pulling in different directions that never quite align. One witness claimed the center deck dropped first and sent a chalky burst downstream. Another insisted the south approach slumped after a truck braked near the crown. A rancher reported hearing 2 distinct impacts with river echoes that sounded like a hallway door. A retired teacher described one long groan as if the river dragged a wet rope across iron. The statements share details but resist consensus, and each page announces certainty with careful handwriting. Avery's pocket notebook surfaced in a banker's box long after the final insurance letter closed. The pages record a sounding taken with a weighted line that read 14 near the mid-channel and 9 closer to the leaning pier. He wrote that drift loads had increased after a storm in early spring and that the upstream pile showed fresh scars. There is a sketch of a void under the clay lip where minnows flick through pale water. He underlined a sentence about scour mitigation with quarry stone and a call to confirm availability within 2 weeks. Kent filed her final report with a tone that suggests fixed habits and a tired office chair. She lists scene hazards that include rebar ends, loose decking, and silt clouds that limit visibility under the truss. She notes a single pickup at the turnout with no occupants and an open toolbox on the tailgate. She records a radio check to County Fire and a request for mutual aid from a neighboring district. Her remarks end with a line about river traffic and 2 anglers who declined to provide names due to a pending tournament. Ross appears next in a terse memo that cites secondhand remarks and a phone call that reached voicemail twice. The memo claims he had walked the south bank with Avery a week earlier and marked 3 soft pockets with orange paint. It suggests he planned to return with fabric and stone once the river fell below the chalk line on the pier. The last certain fact is a signed receipt for gloves and a set of safety glasses at a hardware counter near the square. Every later detail arrives from someone who heard something in a cafe and tucked it between lunch notes. State records list 2 inspections spread across 5 years, with photographs that show a lean toward the east and a hairline crack along a bearing seat. The earlier inspection recommended a load posting that never appeared on either approach. The later inspection assigned a priority that competed with 3 other spans and a culvert collapse on a farm road. A funding note mentions a grant request that stalled after a change in office staff. The document trail grows faint as winter budgets pressed into spring potholes. Mechanical analysis came from a district engineer who used calm sentences and short clauses built for public meetings. He identifies repeated wetting and drying cycles along the timber deck that forced nails to creep. He points toward undermined clay and a narrowed channel that bent current lines against the mid-pier. He writes that a failure origin cannot be fixed with absolute precision due to scoured evidence and missing deck pieces. He asks for a dewatering plan and a crane that never materialized. The county file from 2009 includes photographs with date stamps that do not match the captions typed below. One frame shows a sagging guardrail with rust blooms and a waterline printed like a belt across concrete. Another shows tire marks that end at a splintered edge and a hat resting on a plank. A third shows an empty river surface patterned by wind from the west and a line of bubbles near the far pier. The chain of custody sheet lists a deputy who transferred out and a clerk who retired without an exit interview. Reporters drew maps on legal pads and drove the approaches with a cautious speed of someone reading old pavement for hints. Their articles stitched interviews with shop owners and two fishermen who claimed the river changed color after the first impact. One piece quoted a former inspector who said budget cycles have their own weather and you dress for whatever arrives. Another quoted a county commissioner who insisted the span stood within normal service metrics. The printed narratives offered resolve, while the river ignored the words and moved on. Avery left town within a week, recorded by a receipt for fuel and a breakfast ticket punched with a dull hole. He returned once in late summer to present a slide deck with cross-sections and equation lines that bored the room. He recommended stone placement and new bearings cut for the southern seat. He suggested a temporary Bailey to restore a single lane with strict limits. The minutes reflect nods without motion and a closing remark about waiting for cooler weather. Kent rotated off the ambulance for a quarter and took dispatch shifts under bright fluorescent light that flattened the hours. She handled calls about livestock on roads and a boy with a broken wrist and an older man short of breath. When the bridge comes up, her voice stays neutral while her hands move over paper with careful steadiness. She writes that the river remains a hazard zone and that signage needs nightly checks. She never claims more than the logs can support, and her addenda end with standard phrasing. Ross's path fades, where the road leaves town and crosses open fields toward the old ferry traces. Some locals claimed he was seen near the cottonwoods with a level rod, others placed him at a diner booth that never matched the receipt times. A cousin remembered a story about hauling stone past sunset while the radio caught distant stations. A former coworker insisted Ross called about fabric rolls and left a voicemail that never saved. The file keeps his name, but not his last location, and the river keeps its distance from closure. By winter, the approaches were fenced with mesh, and the signs leaned under north wind that smelled like iron. A temporary span sat in the planning folder and moved between committees like a slow truck. The budget hearings pressed on with pipe repairs and a school roof that leaked onto maps. The river dropped into pale seams across sandbars, and the water showed twisted metal like ribs. People drove around the detour and learned new turns that soon felt old. In spring, a work crew staged rock on the south bank and built a ramp with compacted fill and a simple slope. They moved stone against the lean of the current and watched the water change sound as voids filled. They left gaps where the divers wanted clear space and marked a lane with tall posts. A man with a clipboard checked quantities while a crane idled near the turnout. Nothing in the record names him, and no photograph shows his face. Years later, the road pulls straight toward a replacement span that rides higher over a more disciplined channel. The guardrails shine against early sun, and the deck hums under light traffic that stays within the posted signs. Downstream, the old pilings sit in shallow water like molars under a tired gum line. People fish near the shade and glance toward the bank where the gravel turnout still holds a hard edge. The current moves past their boots and says nothing that a recorder can keep. The file ends without a conclusive sentence, and the county clerk wrote, "Closed for now," along the final margin. The failure sits among numbers and measured lines and voices that hold equal conviction. The river holds its own private archive and never shares the index with the courthouse. The names remain in lists that wait for some future reader to try another alignment. Paper can repeat a story, yet the sound that began the story does not return. The rest stop camera footage from Highway 93. Travelers who stopped along Highway 93 inches northwest Montana still mention a brief clip that circulated for a week. The footage reportedly showed a man walking out of frame near midnight while snow shifted across the empty lot. A sedan idled by the bathrooms and never moved again before dawn touched the pines. No one claimed ownership of the clip, and investigators never confirmed the original source or the download path. The image quality invited arguments rather than conclusions, and the winter air did nothing to settle them. The nearest town was Polson, and the rest stop sat above the lake on a rise that caught hard weather. State records describe the area as a recurring trouble point for visibility and minor collisions during early winter storms. The site had 2 cameras that faced the lot and a third that covered the vending alcove by the mapboard. Archived notes indicate the equipment came from a basic highway contract that rotated vendors every few years without fanfare. None of the paperwork settled where the clip first appeared, and none identified a technician who signed for backups. Some locals claimed a short video floated through a closed group chat used by road crews. The night in question was the second Friday of early December of 2019, according to dispatch logs from Lake County. Snow had begun by late afternoon, and the wind stacked it against the curbs in ridged lines. Plows ran the main lanes before midnight and left a narrow path through the lot for anyone who needed a break. A power blink left the building lights off for several minutes, and then the generator caught and held steady. The logs show a trooper performed a pass-through at 2320 and saw nothing worth marking on the form. The same logs show no calls from the payphone that evening despite the outage. 3 people can be placed there with enough confidence to matter without reaching beyond the available record. The first was Adam Riley, aged 39, a freight driver moving appliance boxes toward Kalispell for a morning offload. He pulled in for coffee and a quick look at his straps, then sat in the cab while the heater fought the cold. The second was Claire Dominguez, aged 32, a biology graduate from Missoula who drove north to meet a supervisor in Whitefish. She used the restroom and texted a roommate who later saved a screenshot for the county file from 2009. The third was Mark Ellison, aged 50, a state maintenance foreman traveling between stockyards to inspect salt sheds after the first storm. He reported iced hinges on a service gate and left a note inside the supply closet for the morning shift. Accounts diverge when the sedan appears in the frame because the angle creates a small blind spot on the driver door. Riley told a deputy that he saw taillights glow brighter twice, which suggested the driver shifted between gears without moving. That detail appears in state records and survives multiple retellings, even though no mechanical issue was later confirmed. Dominguez only recalled the idling sound and a figure by the mapboard who stood with hands in pockets against the wall. Ellison wrote in a maintenance message that a dark vehicle parked near the trash cans and never rolled forward to the pump. The logs show no pump on site, which means the line refers to the air hose near the curb. The footage itself begins at 2338 based on a faded timestamp that never received formal validation from anyone. A figure moves from the vending alcove to the passenger side of the sedan with a slow step that never changes pace. Several frames flicker, and the camera catches snow streaks that cross the lens like scratches pulled from film. The figure leans toward the window, then steps away without opening the door and drifts toward the lot exit without lifting a hand. Headlights from a southbound pickup wash the scene for a second, and the figure is gone from the edge of the frame. The sedan continues to idle, and the clip ends without a clear reason for the cutoff. Investigators never confirmed who downloaded the clip or how it left the original storage cabinet inside the utility room. The vendor at the time maintained a small metal box with a lock that technicians opened during scheduled rotation dates. Archive notes describe a misplaced key during late autumn and a temporary latch that could be nudged with a thin blade. The technician who signed for December maintenance reportedly transferred in January and left no forwarding contact beyond a business mailbox. None of this establishes a leak or a deliberate removal, yet the timing continues to bother the county planner. Records conflict on whether the box was inspected before the storm cycle gained momentum. The sedan belonged to an adjunct instructor from Dillon who had borrowed the car from a colleague for a weekend trip. State records confirm the plate and the title while leaving the route vague between Missoula and the reservation boundary. The instructor, aged 42, taught evening classes and managed 2 short shifts at a bookstore to cover early winter bills. She was reportedly traveling to Columbia Falls to help a relative close a seasonal cabin before the deep freezes returned. A receipt from a bakery in Arley places her on the highway after dark with a bag of bread on the passenger seat. That bag appears in a still frame when the headlights glance across the interior during the flicker. Search efforts began the following morning when a wrecker driver reported the sedan idling without a driver and without hazard lights. A deputy arrived first, according to dispatch logs, and found footprints blown over by streaking snow that erased depth. The doors were locked and the keys sat in the center console with a phone buried under a cloth grocery bag. The trunk was empty and the glove box held registration papers and a folded map with a circle around Olney. Dogs brought to the scene struggled with drift lines and veered toward the tree line where wind piled snow into shoulders. Some locals claimed the scent pulled west toward the highway margin before breaking apart near the culvert. Investigators requested broader camera pulls from nearby businesses and workyards that faced the corridor between the lake and the pass. Several owners cooperated and offered clips that showed plows and a few pickups and a tanker that turned north before midnight. None of the video showed the instructor on foot, and none revealed a second figure near the sedan during the crucial minutes. Records conflict on whether a white compact parked beyond the main lot for a short interval that might matter. An early report mentions a brief shape near the broken fence where Ellison noted the iced hinges on his form. That note sits in the county file from 2009 because older case folders absorbed later cases for space. In the weeks that followed, the rest stop became a point on a map inside a small conference room in Polson. State records show volunteers checked ditches and borrowed pits along Highway 93 from Jet to Rollins during the first clear days. A local pilot offered a slow pass along the lakeshore and reported nothing visible among the shards of ice near the reeds. Troopers returned at night to test reflections and shadow lines across the lot and compared them with the clip in question. They tried to stage a match with a volunteer who wore a wool coat and moved with the same slow step. The camera never produced the same blur, and the lighting refused to line up with the timestamp. A year later, a storm knocked power again, and the generator failed to start, which forced a temporary closure of the site. During that shutdown, workers replaced cables and found a second card wedged behind a plate that covered the main recorder. The card held partial files that opened badly and stopped before the important sequence began, which frustrated the deputy who carried them. A subcontract report states that earlier models sometimes created ghost indexes when power returned after momentary loss. The vendor suggested the card represented a half-written table and not a deliberate swap by anyone with a goal. Investigators never confirmed that explanation, and the working group chose not to issue a statement. Riley kept driving that corridor for another season and later told a reporter that the clip looked cleaner than the original screen. He believed that someone had trimmed noise, which would require access to software and knowledge that he did not possess. Dominguez finished her degree and left the state, though she kept a copy of the screenshot that showed the time. She said the clock on her phone did not match the timestamp, which raised a small question that no one answered. Ellison retired after the following winter and still maintains that a second vehicle idled near the trash cans for a moment. Investigators never confirmed any vehicle beyond the sedan that appears in the known frames. The instructor's family held a private service in Missoula during early spring of 2020 and kept attention away from the site. They worked with a mediator to settle loan questions and a quiet transfer of the borrowed car back to its owner. State records do not reveal friction between parties, and no civil filings came through the courthouse on Main Street. A single notice asked for information regarding the clip and offered a contact that later expired without follow-through. Some locals claimed a new video surfaced 2 winters later and showed the same figure walking at the edge of the lot. Investigators never confirmed the existence of a second clip and warned against reading too much into blurry frames. The rest stop today looks unchanged to passing drivers who slow on the grade and lean toward the lake when wind rises. The vending alcove still holds a faded map with thumbtack holes near the park boundary and an outdated campground icon. A new lock sits on the utility room, and a paper log hangs from a nail where technicians sign in pencil. Dispatch logs still mark minor collisions and a few stranded motorists when the plows fall behind at shift changes. Travelers step out for a minute and talk about the cold that climbs under sleeves before it settles in bones. The lot records what it can, while the cameras blink against snow that moves like static toward the edge of memory. The stories. Ranger station logs noted a missing hiker at noon. The radio crackled just after lunch, and the clipboard showed a blank line beside a borrowed bear spray canister. The word missing sat in block letters on the duty sheet, and the clock over the map board ticked louder than usual. Renata Vale worked the desk that week, 38, seasonal ranger with a stubborn streak for clean paperwork. The station sat outside a popular canyon where the trail ran through scrub pine, and July heat made the air taste metallic. Her plan for the day was simple: clear the lost and found shelf and call 2 vendors about water filters. Plans changed when a volunteer handed her the trail phone and said a worried brother was holding. He said his sister failed to text from the halfway point, and he used the word routine like a spell. He gave a name that did not exactly match the sign-in sheet, and his voice thinned when Renata asked about clothing and pack color. He had a screenshot of their last conversation, time-stamped just before noon, and said a ranger blog recommended checking the canyon switchbacks first. Renata felt the quiet alarm that starts in a seasoned ranger's hands, the kind that steadies rather than shakes. She called the number on the permit sticker that matched the closest name, and a voicemail box chirped with a clipped greeting. She checked the station cameras that watched the parking turnouts and found a silver sedan rolling in at 10:20. The driver wore a brimmed hat and taped the ends of the laces, a detail Renata wrote down because details age poorly when pressure arrives. The volunteer named Marco searched the trailhead kiosk for the morning log, while Renata stepped into the sun and scanned the ridge. Wind pushed dry heat across the gravel, and a jay scolded from the utility pole. She keyed dispatch and said they had a potential overdue hiker, not confirmed, and that initial checks were underway. She kept the language tight because words build momentum, and momentum brings helicopters that the budget cannot always afford. A woman in gym shorts approached with a dog and said she had heard a shout near the lower falls, short and sharp like a name. The dog sniffed the air and leaned toward the creek, then lost interest and sat her down. Renata asked about time and direction, then thanked her and pressed the note card against the map with a magnet. Witness statements fail without anchors, so she pinned the details to the grid and reviewed them aloud. Marco returned with the binder of trail camera stills that interns pulled from a motion unit near the bridge. The images showed the brimmed hat at 11:16, then again at noon on the switchback above the falls. The shirt color looked different under the dappled light, a common effect on digital stills that gave Renata a moment of doubt. She printed 2 frames and circled the pack strap, then clipped them to a clipboard for the field check. Her simple plan melted fully when dispatch called back with archived calls. A person had phoned the tip line at 11:42 and asked about trail closures on the East Rim, then hung up when asked for a callback number. The caller used a masked service that had failed before, and the audio had that empty room sound that suggested a roadside kiosk or a cheap motel. Renata pressed a knuckle against the map and agreed to log the call as related. She put together a step-by-step, starting light and staying local to the canyon. First, a hasty sweep from the bridge to the switchbacks with 1 ranger and 1 volunteer. Second, a parking lot inventory to match plates to permits and to note any vehicles with cooling engines that did not match sign-ins. Third, a witness walk with the dog owner to the lower falls, with a promise to return her to the trailhead within the hour. She radioed the plan and heard the click of acknowledgement from Wyatt Perales, 32, trail tech and steady boots in rough ground. They moved out along the creek, and the summer smell shifted from dust to algae and sunscreen. A couple in sun hats pointed to a narrow ledge where someone had left a crushed water bottle and a candy wrapper. Renata photographed the area with a department phone, then bagged the trash because trash turns into stories when the wrong eyes find it. She kept her sentences short on the radio and noted her times with a pen that left grooves deeper than the ink. At the switchback, Wyatt found boot scuffs that angled off the tread and into scrub so tight it would punish any shortcut. He pointed to a pressed patch of grass, then to a low branch with a pale scrape that matched soft plastic. Renata crouched and saw a faint thread from athletic tape, the same color she remembered from the still. The thread clung to rough bark, a small but useful tether between the images and the ground. They moved higher and reached a shallow spur where the view opened into a dry basin. On the spur, a pair of hikers said they passed a woman alone who looked back often, as if waiting for someone who never arrived. The hikers spoke slowly and paused to remember, then agreed to write brief statements at the station later that afternoon. They offered a photo from a distance that showed only a shape in heat shimmer, and the horizon looked bleached and wide. Renata asked the brother for more context by text, keeping questions narrow and practical. What snacks did she favor? Any injuries last year? And did she ever speak about this specific canyon? He replied that his sister planned the hike to test a new route from a guide forum and sent a blurry screenshot of a message board thread. A username bragged about a hidden shelf that saved 20 minutes, and that sentence pressed a new line into Renata's plan. She called the district's archive and asked for old incident notes related to the shelf, and the clerk said there were 2 minor rescues on a heat weekend 3 summers ago. Those notes described short slips and stubborn walkers and contained a detail that felt right and wrong at the same time. Both incidents started at noon when shadows shortened and depth perception failed, and both involved hikers who disliked crowds and sought quiet. Another message arrived from the brother that changed tone from worried to careful. He said a coworker reportedly spotted a silver sedan at a grocery near the highway at 1:30 with the brimmed hat visible through the windshield. He said the coworker did not want to get involved, and that felt useful in a different way. Renata thanked him and wrote the time down, then circled highway with a question mark that drew a slow breath from Wyatt. They pushed through Manzanita to reach the rumored shelf and found it narrower than described, with a crumbling margin that looked unfriendly. A faint shoe print showed a split tread that matched a popular brand, and a smear on the rock smelled like cheap bug spray. Wyatt anchored a line to a juniper and leaned just far enough to see a small alcove with shade and a clean view of the bridge. A person could wait there unseen, then return to the trail when passing groups moved on. Renata called dispatch to log the shelf and asked for a quiet check on the grocery footage if the store manager would allow it without a formal request. She kept the ask light, and the clerk at the store reportedly agreed to review only the parking lot from 1:15 to 1:45. While they waited, they spoke to a fisherman who said he had heard someone practicing a greeting near the bridge, polite and warm, the way people rehearse before calling an office. They returned to the station to regroup and found the dog owner had kept her promise about the statements. She drew a crude map of her walk and marked the spot where the shout came, which lined up with the shelf by a neat stroke. Renata checked the plate list from the lot, and one entry bothered her because the registration sticker covered an older color. That usually meant a cheap repaint, often done quickly when a car changes hands among friends. The call from the store came back while the clock swept toward 4. Footage reportedly showed a silver sedan near the outer edge, and the driver wore a brimmed hat. The camera caught the driver opening the trunk, then closing it without removing anything. The driver sat for a full minute, then left the lot with a slow signal that suggested careful timing rather than confusion. That action made less sense if a hiker was lost, and more sense if a narrative needed space. Renata asked the brother to send any recent photos of his sister's gear so they could match brands and colors to the thread on the branch. He sent a camping picture from spring, and the pack straps matched the stills with unnerving accuracy. He also sent a photo of a laminated media badge from a fitness channel and apologized for forgetting to mention that side gig. Renata stared at the badge and felt the click of pieces rubbing into place. She pulled the permit files again and found a second entry from the morning that used a near match to the name, with a transposed letter that looked accidental at first glance. The second entry had a note in different handwriting that said, "Early shoot near bridge, approved by office." The office had approved no such shoot as far as Renata knew, and a deep memory of an email warning about unauthorized product videos rose to the surface. Those videos sometimes used stage trouble to capture attention, then rode the wave for clicks and ad buys. She contacted the regional office and asked whether a crew had requested permission that day, and the answer came back tidy and negative. The office asked for details, and Renata kept her language cool and focused on logs and times. She included the masked call and the quiet shelf, and the fact that a brimmed hat appeared where a plan would benefit from a dramatic turn. She asked for guidance on whether to treat the case as a welfare check or as a permit violation with a side of false alarm. Before the office replied, Wyatt flagged a new detail from the camera stills that had felt unimportant earlier. The brimmed hat in the second still carried a small pin that caught the sun, and the same pin appeared on the media badge in the spring photo. It was a tiny compass rose with 3 points bent, a logo for a training program that marketed grit and quiet strength. The pin created a line between online identity and trail identity, often a line people try to blur when views are currency. The volunteer team returned from the upper spur with a clean report and no sign of distress along the ridge. A group of teenagers said they watched a drone rise above the bridge and glide toward the shelf, then return quickly when someone shouted about rules. The teenagers filmed the drone on a phone, and the video captured the brimmed hat figure leaning on the railing, then turning away when the shout landed. Renata saved the clip and documented the time, then asked the group to leave contact details in case the office needed follow-up. As evening lights softened, dispatch called with a quiet advisory. A patrol unit had found a silver sedan parked at a scenic turnout 15 miles east, empty and cooling, with a folded jacket in the back. The officer waited nearby without lights and reported a second vehicle pulling in close, then leaving when the cruiser rolled forward. The plate on the second car belonged to a rental agency with a flexible policy about credit cards, a detail Renata captured without judgment. The office finally replied and advised a welfare check with a parallel inquiry into misuse of emergency channels. They recommended a measured approach that prioritized safety and avoided public drama. Renata agreed, and then called the brother again and asked him to come to the station, explaining that in-person rooms make details easier to manage. He arrived with shoulders high and hands careful, and he looked like someone who disliked being on the wrong side of a counter. He admitted the channel sometimes staged challenges, and that his sister had pitched a solo speed test that needed daylight and a sense of risk. He insisted that no real danger was planned, only a late check-in, followed by a triumphant return, and a lesson about preparation. He said a friend reportedly stood by with water near the highway, and the masked call was about closures because crowds ruined dramatic timing. He said he panicked when she missed the planned text by a full hour and called the station because the bit felt wrong. Renata listened and typed, then asked to speak with the sister by phone. The brother made a call on speaker, and the brimmed hat answered with a small breath, then a quick apology that sounded practiced. She said she was safe and nearby, and that she feared trouble once she realized how many people had watched the bridge. She agreed to meet at the station within 30 minutes and added that the shelf was a mistake because the rock felt greasy and mean. She arrived with salt on her face and a steady gaze, 34, freelance trainer and editor for a mid-sized channel. She wore the pin on the brim and kept her hands open on the counter, then gave a full account that matched much of the timeline. She described the shelf and the alcove and admitted the staged silence to build tension for a cut. She said the drone operator backed out when a shout scared him and that the grocery stop was a pause to decide whether to end the bit early. Renata walked her through the consequences with a calm voice and clear steps. They would log the misuse of the term missing in the station ledger and forward a report on the masked call to the office. They would recommend a fine for the drone flight near the bridge and review the permit files for the transposed name entry. They would also offer a voluntary donation to the volunteer team for the hours spent and recommend a public safety note if the channel posted any edited footage. The woman nodded and said she understood, then asked whether the station planned to call the county. Renata said the county dispatch already sat in the loop and had agreed to remain cooperative as long as the channel avoided inflaming viewers. She added that the station took missing reports seriously because moments consume resources, and that even staged quiet pressures real systems. The woman agreed to record a clear statement and accepted a brochure on safe filming that looked oddly gentle in the harsh light. Wyatt stepped outside and watched the last cars roll out of the lot, and the air finally cooled enough to feel kind. The dog from earlier barked once from a passing truck, and the fisherman from the creek lifted 2 fingers without slowing. Renata filed the forms and wrote a final note that tied the shelf to the old rescues and the pin to the badge and the masked call to timing. The station lights hummed and the clock hands slid past 6, then found their mark without ceremony. By the time the brother and sister left, the word missing on the duty sheet had a line through it. Renata kept the original note card with the magnet hole because records tell stories when memory wants to embellish. The office would likely call tomorrow and ask for clarifications, and the drone policy would probably gain a new sentence. She felt the usual mix of relief and irritation that follows a false alarm, and the strange sympathy for people who turn risk into currency. Later, the channel posted a short video that downplayed the panic, and the comments argued about rules and grit. The station received 2 thank you emails from hikers who heard the news secondhand and a complaint from a person who disliked the fines on principle. Renata archived the messages and watered the plant on the windowsill, then wrote one more line in the log about the shelf that was not a shortcut. The sentence ended with a plain warning that noon creates flat shadows and false confidence, a small truth inside a larger one. In quiet moments after a shift like that, she believed most people want a story that forgives them. Trails do not forgive, they teach. And the classroom never closes just because cameras blink. The station would open again at 7, and the clipboard would carry new names, and the clock would tick in the same steady way. Somewhere on the ridge, a jay would scold the wind, and the shelf would wait with its narrow promise, ready to turn bravado into paperwork. The Bridge Creek drowning that wasn't recorded. Locals in Deschutes County still mention a cold evening on Bridge Creek when a man vanished without an official entry. Witnesses later argued over the hour and the light while the water ran clear and slow beneath alder shade. The only certainty, according to archived notes kept in Bend, was that the call for help never landed where it should. The gap in paperwork turned an ordinary search into a puzzle that keeps reappearing in winter conversations. The man most often named was Trent Avery, 42, contract carpenter, in the area to price repairs on a seasonal cabin. He reportedly arrived 2 days earlier and slept in his truck near Sisters to save money, according to a motel clerk. The cabin owner said he never signed in or asked for a key because daylight was already fading near the ridge. The owner told deputies he expected a text that never came, which is a detail that repeats across later statements. Avery met one person that afternoon, a fisheries tech named Mara Collins, 34, state employee, checking culvert screens along a Forest Service spur. She said the creek looked safe for a crossing at the ford, which remained shallow where gravel spread across 2 tire lanes. Her state records log for that date lists water clarity as good and current speed as moderate with no debris above the culvert. She remembered a white cooler in his truck bed and a neatly folded jacket on the passenger seat. Dispatch logs from that week show wildfire smoke along the highway and intermittent tower issues between Sisters and Camp Sherman. A technician wrote that calls sometimes hopped east before returning, which could explain later confusion over which county heard the first report. A private tower contractor filed a brief noting brief resets during the evening hour when shadows lengthened across the creek. The record is not a smoking gun, but it sits near the time window witnesses describe. Collins said she left him near 5 while the light still held, and the ford looked routine for any cautious driver. She told investigators he waved and asked about the old bridge pilings that stick from the bank near the bend. She reportedly replied that the pilings belonged to a logging ramp that washed out when storms changed the channel 2 winters back. She did not recall him stepping into the water or walking the gravel bar to test the footing. State records list a cloud front moving in from the northwest with cooler air that sometimes makes breath show at dusk. A ranger out of Sisters wrote that the creek often looks tame until a beaver dam upstream lets a pulse slide through. That can raise water a few inches quickly, which becomes meaningful in a narrow crossing where tires already press wet stones. The ranger did not say this happened that night, only that such pulses occur without sound along that reach. The first missing person alert does not exist in the county file from 2009, though later forms reference an original call. One deputy said the form might have been faxed to a non-emergency line that stopped accepting overnight traffic. Another deputy thought a visitor probably dialed from near the highway and hit the wrong jurisdiction due to the tower skip. The absence of a timestamp feeds the theory that information arrived in pieces and never landed in a single folder. Two anglers claimed they saw a dome light blinking near the ford sometime after dark while the truck sat angled to the bank. They argued about whether the engine idled or whether they only heard water sliding against stones under the alders. Some locals claimed a third person approached the scene on a bicycle and left without speaking, though investigators never confirmed such a rider. Their statements match on the dome light detail and diverge on almost every other point. Avery's sister later provided archived notes from his phone bills that show attempts to call a Ben number around 8. The number belongs to the cabin owner who had already driven home to Redmond and silenced his ringer above the garage. Records conflict on whether a voicemail ever arrived because the carrier log shows activity while the device log shows only a missed call. The discrepancy is small yet meaningful when trying to place a voice in a narrow hour along the creek. Searchers walked both banks at first light and found boot tracks that entered from the gravel bar and faded where cobble turned firm. A tape measure in a photograph shows a stride that stays even then shortens near a shallow channel cut by the previous week rain. They recovered the white cooler 50 yards downstream, caught against willow roots, with the lid unlatched but nothing inside. The jacket remained on the passenger seat exactly as Collins described, which adds a quiet weight to her timeline. A retired deputy who reviews Coldfield files said the map grid for the initial sweep sits one square too far east. He blamed a habit of copying last season templates during busy weeks and missing small shifts in volunteer practice. That oversight pushes a key waypoint off the creek, which could explain why a thermal search missed a figure in the brush. He did not frame this as proof that someone waited there, only that the error changed where people looked first. In later interviews, a hardware clerk in Sisters remembered Avery buying a short toe strap and a shovel with a fiberglass handle. The clerk thought he mentioned a soft approach near a ford where ruts filled and needed a few minutes with a blade. The receipt time lines up with Collins and the ranger notes, which places him near the creek before dusk with reasonable tools. The purchase does not prove a crossing attempt, yet it keeps the possibility within a narrow band of motives. A volunteer firefighter described a call that almost arrived, a carrier ping that appears in a phone report but not in dispatch logs. He said the station door was open for inventory and the tone speakers clicked once without the usual follow message. He wrote his memory down years later for a training handout, which makes it more story than record. Still, several younger volunteers say they heard similar clicks during that month when the tower resets annoyed crews. Divers checked a pool downstream where the channel tightens and lifts small whirl lines against a rock rib under the bank. Visibility stayed poor due to fine silt stirred by a mid-morning wind and a brief flow rise from upstream wetlands. They found no clothing or wallet and no keys, which matches the detail that the truck cab stayed unlocked at the scene. The diver lead said the bottom felt mostly smooth with scattered roots that would have caught a heavy object easily. Weeks later, a property survey crew flagged a scrap of fabric trapped on barbed wire near a floodplain meadow. The piece looked like work pant material and carried fine silt that stains in the specific way Bridge Creek water does. A lab in Salem could not confirm much beyond weave and color range, which overlaps with common brands used by local contractors. The finding neither closes the case nor clears any doubts about the unrecorded call that started the confusion. Avery's truck eventually left the impound lot and returned to family after a modest court order that resolved a storage dispute. The odometer reading suggested little movement beyond the approach and the short angle found by deputies at first light. Tire pressure on the right front ran low enough to pull a light vehicle toward the wet edge during a cautious attempt. A mechanic said that detail matters only if a driver felt rushed and chose not to air up before crossing. Some residents claimed he might have walked out before midnight after losing patience with the patchy calls and weak signal near the ford. Others said a car picked him up on the highway and drove north toward Warm Springs, a route that thins quickly after dark. Investigators never confirmed either thread because camera coverage along that stretch remains limited and cash purchases leave quiet trails. The two stories survive because neither collides with the evidence found by the creek. Years after the search, a regional auditor reviewed communications procedures and noted that inter-county coordination improved during the next season. The report mentions additional training with tower vendors and a shared checklist when pings show cross-jurisdiction drift for emergency calls. None of that resolves where Avery went, yet it addresses the blank square where his first alert should have lived. The lesson sits quietly in meeting minutes while the creek keeps moving stones along the shallows. The file remains open in a narrow sense with periodic review when new hikers report odd finds in willow tangles after spring runoff. Most of those reports fade after a deputy drives out and looks where grass has already leaned and lifted again. The absence of a recovered body keeps speculation tethered to polite voices in diners near the highway and the mill. The story persists because the paperwork gap made a simple night on a small creek feel like an argument that never ends.